The hallway was silent except for the soft squeak of worn shoes on polished tile. David Ellis, a black janitor with kind eyes and tired shoulders, knelt near the pediatric waiting room. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small bottle of soap and a plastic wand. Without a word, he blew a slow stream of bubbles into the air. A little girl across the room, Eliza, age 7, autistic, nonverbal, had been mid-meltdown, curled into herself, rocking and sobbing. But when the bubbles floated past her, shimmering like tiny rainbows, she froze. Her wide, tear-streaked eyes followed them, her fingers uncurled, her breathing steadied. For the first time in hours, she was calm. David didn't notice the shadow at the end of the corridor. A woman stood frozen, hand pressed her mouth, tears running down her face. She had watched dozens of specialists fail her daughter, but this quiet janitor had reached her in seconds. V.O. He didn't know his kindness would change everything. David Ellis had worked the night shift at Mercy Children's Hospital for almost 7 years. By title, he was just a janitor, a man with keys clipped to his belt, pushing a mop down silent halls while doctors and nurses walked past him like he was furniture. Most barely nodded. Some didn't even look. But the children noticed him. Every night, David brought little things in his bag. Colorful stickers, glow-in-the-dark stars, stuffed animals donated to thrift stores. He cleaned their rooms with a smile and always asked if they were okay. Some kids called him Mr. Bubbles. Others just called him the guy who makes it not scary. He never said no when a child was afraid to be alone. He just pulled out that tiny bottle from his pocket and started blowing bubbles into the air. Big, slow, quiet ones. It was something his own daughter used to love. And even though those days were long gone, the habit stayed. He lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment across from a grocery store and raised his 12-year-old daughter, Maya, by himself. Her mom had walked out years ago, and he never looked back. Money was tight, but Maya never went without. He packed her lunch every morning, fixed her hair before school, and made sure the light in the hallway stayed on at night because she still hated the dark. David used to be a maintenance supervisor at a high-rise downtown, but after a workplace injury and budget cuts, he ended up here, scrubbing pediatric wards, cleaning up after sick kids, and somehow finding joy in it. But to the hospital staff, he was invisible, a name on a schedule, a figure in a uniform. They rolled their eyes when he offered to fix a beeping monitor or told him, "Stick to mops, Ellis." He never fought back. He just nodded, kept his head down, and went on. But the kids knew better. They waited for him during the night shift. Some nurses found drawings taped to walls. David would cape, or David holding a bubble wand like a magic wand. Parents would occasionally ask, "Who's this man my child keeps talking about?" And the nurses would shrug, "Just a janitor." Every day, David worked in silence. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't chasing promotions or praise. All he wanted was to make the hospital feel a little less frightening. For children who were scared, for parents who were exhausted, and maybe, deep down, for himself. Because even though Maya was healthy now, there had been a time when he'd walked these same halls as a terrified young father. He had once watched her hooked up to IVs, tubes, monitors. The beeping had haunted his dreams for months. That's where the bubbles started. It had been the only thing that stopped her from crying. Now it was his quiet legacy. No one in the hospital knew how many kids had smiled because of him. No one knew how many tiny acts of kindness he had left behind, like footprints, in the hallway. But David didn't need recognition. He had work to do. And that night, when he blew a stream of bubbles into the air to comfort a child he didn't know, he thought it was just another quiet act of care. He didn't know her name. He didn't know who was watching. He didn't know that moment would echo through the lives of everyone in that hospital. It started with a scream, sharp, high-pitched, echoing off the walls of the pediatric lobby. Eliza Langford, age 7, had just arrived with a nurse escort. Her mother, delayed in traffic, had arranged for the hospital's private service to admit her early for neurodevelopmental tests. But the moment Eliza stepped through the sliding glass doors, everything unraveled. She spun in circles, hands over her ears, face contorted in panic. Her small body collapsed near the reception desk, shaking violently. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the intercom too loud, the unfamiliar faces too close. Her file had a note, nonverbal, sensory sensitive, prone to extreme meltdowns. But no note could prepare anyone for what unfolded. A crowd began to gather. Nurses looked at each other helplessly. One reached out and was met with a piercing shriek. Another tried to dim the lights, but the panic only grew. The head nurse grabbed her walkie. "We need a behavioral specialist down here, now." David had just stepped out of the elevator with his mop cart when he heard the noise. His first instinct was to step back, but then he saw her, curled on the floor like a cornered animal, her tiny fingers clawing at the air. No adult around her knew what to do. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He reached into his janitor's pocket and pulled out a small bubble wand. He knelt several feet away, dipped the wand into the tiny bottle, and blew. The first bubble floated gently over her head. Then another, and another, shimmering orbs dancing through the air, catching the hospital light like fragments of magic. Eliza stopped screaming. Her hands dropped slowly. Her eyes, wide and glossy with tears, locked onto the floating bubbles. One drifted close to her face. She didn't flinch. She smiled. Gasps filled the lobby. A nurse froze mid-step. A security guard lowered his walkie. Even the receptionist, who had seen it all, covered her mouth in disbelief. In less than a minute, the chaos was gone, replaced by a strange, still calm. Eliza stood up on her own. She reached out toward the bubbles with trembling fingers. Then, gently, she sat on the floor, watching. David kept blowing, slower now, almost rhythmically. He didn't look at the others. He wasn't doing it for applause. He just wanted the girl to feel safe. He had no idea that upstairs, someone had seen everything, and wasn't just watching. She was crying. Victoria Langford stood silently in the corridor, her heels planted on the cold tile, her eyes fixed on the security monitor outside the pediatric wing. She hadn't meant to spy. She'd only asked for Eliza's check-in footage out of routine caution, but what she saw on the screen stopped her breath. Her daughter, calm, not medicated, not restrained, not screaming, just sitting peacefully, watching bubbles float around her like they belonged there. And the man responsible wasn't a world-class behavioral therapist or Harvard-trained neuropsychologist. He was a janitor, an older black man in scrubs, kneeling without a word, blowing soap into the air. Victoria's hand covered her mouth. Tears welled up before she could stop them. She had spent over $2 million on experts in the last 3 years. Private therapy clinics, sensory integration labs, elite boarding programs. All of them failed to reach Eliza. At best, they managed compliance. At worst, trauma. Victoria remembered the last therapist, cold clinical, telling her, "Your daughter may never emotionally bond with anyone." She'd left that session and sobbed in the back seat of her car for 20 minutes. And yet, here, on a random Thursday morning in a public hospital, a janitor had done what no one else could. Victoria stepped closer to the screen, narrowing her eyes. "Who is he?" she whispered to herself. Her assistant stood nearby, unsure whether to speak. "His name's David Ellis. Night janitor. Works quietly. Never caused problems." Victoria didn't respond. Her mind was racing. How did a man with no credentials, no titles, no training, succeed where billion-dollar programs had failed? She kept watching the footage. David didn't try to talk. He didn't force eye contact. He didn't approach Eliza. He just blew bubbles with patience and love. A lump formed in her throat. For the first time in years, Victoria felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. But also shame. Because in her world, tech moguls, boardrooms, quarterly profits, people like David Ellis were invisible. Until now. Later that night, long after the halls had emptied and the buzz of the day had quieted, David Ellis scrubbed the same pediatric wing floor with slow, steady strokes. He moved like a man used to long hours, used to being overlooked. His back ached, but he didn't complain. He never did. Earlier that week, his supervisor had pulled him aside in the supply closet. "Budget's tight," the man said flatly. "We're letting a few people go next month. Just a heads up." David had nodded, even smiled a little, masking the silent panic that followed him home. He couldn't afford to lose his job. Rent was due in 8 days. Maya needed school supplies. The car needed new brake pads. And there were nights he barely slept thinking about what they'd do if he was out of work. Still, at the hospital, he never showed it. He mopped the floors like they were the most important thing in the building. He greeted every child with the same warm smile, even when the nurses whispered behind his back. Why is he always hanging around the kids' wing? I heard he gives them candy. Isn't that weird? He doesn't belong here. David heard it all, but he didn't let it show. What no one knew, what no one ever asked, was that he had once walked these same corridors not as an employee, but as a father. Her name was Ava, his daughter, his firstborn. She had been diagnosed with severe autism at age 3, nonverbal, sensory aversions, meltdowns triggered by even the sound of a microwave beep. David had learned everything, every therapy, every technique, every gentle way to guide her through a world that overwhelmed her senses. They had spent hundreds of nights in hospitals just like this, and it was during one of those hospital stays that he discovered the power of bubbles. A nurse had offered him a leftover party favor, and in desperation, David had tried it. Ava had smiled for the first time in days. He never forgot, but Ava didn't make it. A respiratory infection, complications, one bad night. She was 5. He never told anyone at Mercy about her. Not once. It wasn't their business. It was his quiet ache, buried deep beneath a layer of service and silence. But every time a scared child cried alone in their room, every time a parent looked too tired to speak, David remembered, and he stepped forward, not because it was his job, but because it was his calling. He knew how it felt to be helpless. He knew what it was like to pray for calm. He knew what it meant to be unseen until the moment you weren't. He didn't need a degree to understand fear in a child's eyes. He didn't need applause to offer comfort. He just needed to keep going. And so, every night, after taking out the trash and refilling the sanitizer, David would pause at the end of the hallway, open his coat pocket, and blow one quiet stream of bubbles into the darkness. For the children, for Ava, for himself. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet imagine, was that someone was about to change his life. Not out of pity, not out of protocol, but because finally someone powerful had truly seen him. The next morning, Victoria Langford sat in the hospital's administrative office, legs crossed, fingers tapping against a mahogany desk. She didn't like wasting time, and she especially didn't like unanswered questions. She glanced at the nameplate. Angela Peters, assistant administrator. I need to know who the janitor was in the pediatric lobby yesterday. Victoria said calmly, the one who helped my daughter. Angela barely looked up from her screen. Probably David Ellis. He's on the overnight shift. And what? What do you know about him? Angela shrugged. He's just a cleaner, Ms. Langford. No formal training. Doesn't even have a college degree. Far as I know. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Had a few complaints from staff about overstepping. Talking to patients without permission. Victoria's eyes narrowed. I want a copy of his employee file and any security footage from the last 6 months. Angela hesitated. Is there a problem? No, Victoria said, her tone sharp. But if your staff had one person capable of reaching my daughter and didn't know it, then yes, that's a problem. 3 hours later, Victoria sat in her town car with a file folder on her lap. She read every page. David Ellis, age 48, no criminal record, former maintenance supervisor, widowed, 1 daughter, Maya. Notes from HR included things like, takes initiative, beloved by pediatric patients, received parent thank you letters on multiple occasions. What stood out most was a handwritten letter from 3 years ago. David helped my autistic son through the worst night of his life. He is a gift to this hospital. Then, buried near the back, a note from an old HR manager, now retired. Lost a child. Still shows up early. Never asked for praise. Victoria stared at it for a long time. That afternoon, she returned to the hospital. No one noticed the billionaire walking quietly down the halls, dressed in plain clothes. She watched from around corners as David tied a little girl's shoelaces, adjusted a teddy bear's bandage, and offered nurse his last granola bar because she hadn't eaten. None of it was for show. None of it was performative. It was just who he was. Victoria's heart beat heavy in her chest. She had spent years surrounded by experts who charged a fortune and delivered so little. And here was a man with nothing, giving everything. She wasn't just intrigued now. She was invested. It only took one whisper to undo everything. The following morning, David was cleaning room 204 when his supervisor, Mr. Collins, appeared at the doorway, arms crossed, face hard. A tall man with a clipboard complex and a chip on his shoulder. Collins had never liked David. Too many compliments from parents. Too many smiles from nurses. And now, a billionaire asking questions? Ellis, he said sharply, come with me. Now. In the administrator's office, Collins slapped a file on the desk. We've received a complaint. David blinked. About what? Collins flipped open a manila folder. Inside were screenshots from security footage. Images of David kneeling near Eliza, bubbles midair. You were in close proximity to a minor, without parental consent. No nurse present. That's a violation. You mean the girl in the lobby? David asked, stunned. She was having a meltdown. We're not here to debate your intent. Collins cut in. You're being suspended pending investigation. Effective immediately. But I didn't do anything wrong, David whispered. Tell it to HR. You're done for now. Collins didn't even let him pack his things. A security guard escorted David to the main hallway like a criminal. Staff paused mid-conversation. Some stared. A few whispered. No one said a word in his defense. He didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked, quiet and broken. That same afternoon, Victoria Langford received a voicemail from her assistant. That janitor, David, was removed today. Something about a policy breach. At first, Victoria didn't understand. Then, slowly it registered. They had taken that moment, Eliza's first calm moment in months, and turned it into a scandal. She didn't cry this time. She slammed her laptop shut, grabbed her coat, and stormed toward her car. Someone was about to answer for this. Victoria Langford didn't make an appointment. She didn't send an assistant. She walked straight into the hospital's executive boardroom, flanked by her personal legal advisor and a flash drive in her hand. Angela Peters, the assistant administrator, stood up from her seat. Ms. Langford, this is a private. Sit down, Victoria said coldly. She plugged the flash drive into projector and turned to face the stunned room. I want you all to watch this. The lights dimmed. The screen lit up with the security footage in the pediatric lobby. Eliza crying, thrashing, surrounded by nervous staff. Then, David, kneeling slowly, blowing bubbles. Silence fell over the room as Eliza calmed, watched, smiled. One nurse in the back sniffled. Even Angela looked away. When the lights came back on, Victoria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You suspended the only person who's ever reached my daughter, she said, staring straight at Collins. You mistook compassion for misconduct, and you humiliated a man who should have been honored. No one dared respond. I've already spoken to my legal team, she continued. This institution will issue a formal apology by end of day, full reinstatement, full benefits, and back pay. And David Ellis won't be returning as a janitor, she added, pulling a letter from her purse. She handed it to Angela. Effective immediately, he is now the Chief Child Wellness Officer at Langford Foundation Pediatric Outreach. Salary, triple his previous pay. He starts Monday. She paused and said softly, he deserves more than you could ever give him, and so do the children here. Then she walked out. Just like that, the man they ignored became the man they now whispered about, for all the right reasons. 6 months later, the Langford Pediatric Wellness Center opened its doors in the heart of the city. Glass walls, indoor gardens, sensory rooms, therapy wings designed not by architects, but by the very children they were built for. And at the heart of it all stood David Ellis, no longer wearing janitor scrubs, but tailored vests with a name badge that read, Director Child Comfort and Development, David walked the halls not as background, but as purpose. Children greeted him by name. Parents shook his hand. Therapists took notes on his methods. He didn't use textbooks. He used trust. One morning, Eliza came running down the hallway. Yes, running. She stopped in front of him, clutching a bubble wand in her hand. She looked up at him with bright, knowing eyes and whispered her first word. Bubbles. David dropped to his knees as his vision blurred with tears. He hadn't cried like that in years, not since Ava. Later that week, during the dedication ceremony, Victoria handed him a plaque with trembling hands. In memory of Ava Ellis, it read, "Whose quiet strength lives on in every child we serve." David placed it gently above the entrance to the therapy wing, then looked out over the crowd. Parents, children, reporters, doctors, a space full of people who now saw what they had once ignored. The next morning, local headlines read, "Former janitor transforms pediatric care through simple act of kindness. Eliza Langford speaks her first word. Because a man named David Ellis, a bubble changed everything." Sometimes, the lowest ranked person in the building makes the biggest impact. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a therapist. He didn't wear a badge of status, only one of service. Yet, in a moment when no one knew what to do, David Ellis chose compassion over protocol. And that changed everything. Because kindness is power, dignity is strength, and real heroes don't always wear suits. Sometimes they carry a mop and a bottle of bubbles. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you believe that one act of kindness can change the world, then this story was meant for you.